and U.S. military in Korea.
The first reported case of AIDS in the United States was in 1981. Since then, the epidemic has spread around the world, with Korea's first documented case occurring in 1985. On December 14, 1985, it was reported that a Korean construction worker dispatched to Saudi Arabia was tested positive for HIV. He was then deported to Korea on the ground that he might be contagious. He was immediately flown back to Korea, quarantined, tested for antibodies, and found to be positive once again. This made him the first official case of HIV infection in Korea, but in reality, the virus had been in Korea long before that. In the first half of 1983, the Korean media reported that there was an incurable epidemic of acquired immunodeficiency syndrome in the US, citing foreign sources. The portrayed stereotype that most patients were sexual minorities, drug users, or Haitians was perpetuated. Meanwhile, Korean Health Authority realized that US troops in Korea would be an important source of viral transmission. But since Korea could not mandate testing of the US troops, they could only ask the US military to cooperate. Meanwhile, the US military had been conducting its own AIDS testing of their troops and comfort women around its bases since early 1985. The exact process by which the US government became interested in this troop in Korea, and in particular in infection through on-base sex trafficking, is difficult to ascertain, but can be indirectly inferred from a paper which was published in that year. The paper presented the results of an epidemiological survey of a man admitted to a Walter Reed Army Medical Center in US with symptoms of AIDS. Its main claim was that AIDS could be transmitted from woman to man, rather than through having sexual relationship between men. As mentioned earlier, in the early days of the AIDS epidemic, the virus was thought to be transmitted mostly through having sex between men. However, the study of soldiers found that heterosexual contact was equally at risk of infection. And 2 of the 15 reported cases had history of deployment in Korea, meaning that these 2 men were likely to have acquired AIDS during their time spent in Korea. In the first half of 1985, there was a US military investigation of female sex workers around the US military base located near Seoul. The Korean government was apparently unaware that these tests were conducted. It was only in September 1985 that the Korean health authorities was informed of the antibody positive found here. Prior to this, in July 1985, the person tested to be positive of HIV was found during a routine testing of blood donations. She worked as a hairdresser near the US military base and was not a sex worker. Although she was not symptomatic, she repeatedly tested positive for antibodies. The fact that it was found among the general population, not just sex workers with high risk, meant that HIV might already be endemic in Korea. But the Korean government chose to keep all of this under the rug, essentially because it was a transmission from the US military. This could pose a political discomfort between Korea and the US if the general public found the situation and the national security could be affected accordingly.
Making AIDS Prevention Act.
The Korean government used these Japanese resources as inspiration to enact the AIDS Prevention Act in Korea. The government touted the main points of the legislation as the functions and duties of the state as the primary caretaker, the obligations of the public to be prevented, the reporting procedure and duties of medical institutions and medical personnel for early detection of the patient and antibody-positive individuals, the formation of task forces and specialized subcommittees, and epidemiological survey and preventive treatment research. However, much of the legislation was actually punitive. It included penalties for those who did not comply with the instruction of health authorities, prohibition on breaching confidentiality that affected the human right of patient, and penalties for carriers of the disease. The inclusion of human rights violating elements, such as punishment for transmitters, was recognized by the Ministry of Health at the time. This noted the anticipated problems with the legislation and called for a detailed understanding of its intentions. It also bared in mind the complaints of related groups and the perverse effect of global spotlight in the run-up to the Olympics. An overly coercive and punitive AIDS prevention law would draw undue international attention to Korea's situation in the run-up to the Olympics, and cast the country's already severe human rights abuses under the military regime in a more negative light. Meanwhile, the Ministry of Health and Social Affairs, which had been monitoring the progress of Japan's legislation, obtained a revised draft of the Japanese law on March 19th. This noted that it had undergone significant changes from the original draft, essentially removing the provision prohibiting and punishing transmission behavior. However, a week later, in a presidential directive issued after meeting with Legal Affairs Bureau, the president directly ordered to rush ahead with strictly governing legislative measure for prevention, mentioned that Korea did not need to reference legislation in developed countries. For example, without reference to the Japanese legislation, which had largely removed coercive measures. The final legislative process of the AIDS Prevention Act and the detailed policies to be implemented were being decided in the second half of 1987. It was when the political turbulence in Korean society, such as the nationwide democratic movement, meant that the decision-making structure within the Ministry of Health was not functioning. As a result, the process of conceiving, formulating, and implementing the AIDS Prevention Act went path-dependent on existing infectious disease or sexually transmitted disease control policies. There was little debate on whether the penal provision would actually be effective in preventing the epidemic, and little challenge from civil society was made. As a result, the AIDS Prevention Act was passed through Parliament in December 1987 without much controversy. From the beginning of the AIDS epidemic in Korea, the government kept the epidemic under wrap, partly because of its relationship with its key ally, the United States, and partly because of international competition such as the Olympics. But once it became known that antibody-positive people were arriving in country through the US military, the government tried to limit the epidemic to sex workers in the US military. Then, after the Saudi Arabian worker was found to be positive, the government tried to limit the epidemic to cases exposed abroad. It wanted to treat it as something that only happened in specific groups. The enactment of the AIDS Prevention Act just before the Olympics and in the middle of political turbulence in Korea was a means to cover it up. The ban on transmitting behavior was also a declarative message to high-risk groups not to reveal their existence, rather than a public health objective to stop transmission. But it's important to remember that this pressure was built not only by the state but also the consent of the public. In the run-up to the Olympics, there was a shared sense of urgency to stem the flow of AIDS and the epidemic, and human rights became an afterthought. A symbol of this was the amendment to the AIDS Prevention Act in December 1988, which was made shortly after the Games and introduced by 163 MPs more than half of the total number of MPs in parliament at the time, and added a provision allowing for the requirement of full testing of foreign nationals. And upon arrivals, they must present proof of an AIDS test result. It was a provision that had been excluded from the original 1987 law due to international relations and human rights concerns. At the same time, it was a reminder of Korea's changing position. Korea, once an exporter of disease, became a worried importer of it. But in the process, the remnants of coercive, punishment-focused disease control from its colonial and military dictatorship past had not disappeared. Thank you.